Dear students, in today's module, we will discuss the topic environmental movements. Before I begin environmental movements, let me give an example of an event which took place in 1970 in United States. On April 22nd, 1970, millions of Americans took to the streets to protest against the negative impacts of almost 150 years of industrialization. The event was known as the Earth Day, and since then, Earth Day is being celebrated every year on 22nd of April to celebrate nature, to protest against degradation of nature and the negative impacts of industrialization. And recently on 26th and recently on the Earth Day of 2016, the Paris Climate Agreement was signed by almost 120 countries. Since 1970s, collective mobilization concerning nature are constantly on rise across the globe, and environmental movement has emerged as a global movement. When we see this global spread of environmental concerns and environmental movements, certain questions come to mind. What are these environmental movements? How can we conceptualize these environmental movements? Why do people participate in environmental movements? And what are the different types of these environmental movements? Because as we already discussed, that environmental movement or environmentalism is not a homogeneous idea, and there are various types and diversities of environmentalism. So what are these environmental movements? So let us discuss in today's class the basic concept of environmental movement and different types of environmental movements. The broad objective of today's class is to conceptualize environmental movements and explore the nature, characteristics and typology of these movements. After successful completion of this module, we will be able to comprehend environmental movements and identify different types of environmental movements that we see across the globe. We will also be able to explain different approaches and different types of environmental movements that is prevalent in contemporary times. In today's class, we will basically discuss three topics. We will begin with a conceptualization of environmental movement. We will try to comprehend environmental movement by defining it, by trying to conceptualize it. Secondly, we will move on to develop a typology of environmental movements, where we will classify environmental movements into different categories. And the third part of this class, we will discuss about the common characteristics or nature of environmental movements. Let us begin with conceptualizing environmental movements. We know that environmental movements emerged in late 60s and early 1970s. Among the different movements that began their journey from 1960s and 70s, perhaps environmental movement is the only movement which has retained its vigor and vitality and has emerged as truly global movements. The success of environmental movements are evident from the variety of environmental legislations that are crafted in the world, in different parts of the world, and the amount of forest and space and animals that it has protected globally because of these movements. So therefore, environmental movements have emerged as the most comprehensive environmental movements have emerged as the most dominating movement in contemporary times. Manuel Castells, the Spanish sociologist, says that environmental movements are becoming the most comprehensive and the most influential movement of our times. Defining environmental movements, Manuel Castells writes, these environmental movements in their own way and through the creative cacophony of its multiple voices, environmentalism challenges the global ecological disorder brought about by uncontrolled global development and by the unleashing of unprecedented technological forces without checking their social and environmental sustainability. When we see these environmental movements, we use this or we see this in our everyday life. But how do we conceptualize these environmental movements? How do we define these environmental movements? Perhaps it becomes difficult to conceptualize, to give a precise definition of environmental movements, because when we see these movements range between people's opinion at one extreme to organized pressure groups and political parties at the other. So therefore, there is a wide range of these environmental movements, and environmental action cuts across parallel forms of collective action across fields of ethnicity, gender, human rights, peace and nuclear disarmament. So in that sense, environmental movements are so diverse, environmental movements are so varied that it becomes difficult to give a precise definition of environmental movements. But we should also realize that environmental movements are a specific kind of social mobilization concerning nature. In that sense, environmental movement is a social movement. Can we depend upon social movement framework to understand environmental movements? Can we draw insights from social movements to define environmental movement? Let us try how can we define environmental movements drawing upon the social movement framework. Drawing upon the social movement framework, American sociologists Ron Ehrman and Andrew Jamison defined environmental movement in the following way. I quote Ehrman and Jamison: environmental movements are relatively brief period between constitution of the knowledge interest which define the movement and their institutionalization. In that sense, for Ehrman and Jamison, environmental movement is the small environmental movements are those small period of activity or those small efforts which begins with the knowledge creation, which begins with the construction of knowledge, construction of awareness about environment, and which ends with institutionalization of these knowledge interest. So therefore, for Ehrman and Jamison, environmental movements are those small periods which begins with construction of knowledge about nature, knowledge about environment, and which ends with their institutionalization. Institutionalization may be in the form of university departments, may be in the form of professional organizations, may be in the form of professional green parties. So in that sense, for Ehrman and Jamison, professional, organized or institutionalized endeavors, institutional activities concerning nature are not or cannot be defined as environmental movements. Because Ehrman and Jamison distinguish between social movement and their organization. According to Ehrman and Jamison, social movements are not an institutionalized activity because it is always anti-institutional, it is always anti-systemic. Because according to Ehrman and Jamison, although movements are usually involved creation of an organization, it is important to distinguish between movement from their organization. Organizations, according to them, can be thought as a vehicle of carrying or transporting or even producing the movement's meaning, but the meaning should not be reduced to the medium. In that sense, environmental movements are not organizational activity or institutionalized activity. There is a difference between environmental movement and environmental movement organizations. The organized activities or the institutionalized activities doesn't characterize to be defined as a movement. So therefore, according to Ehrman and Jamison, environmental movements are always anti-institutional. So therefore, institutionalized activities, institutionalized organized activities to protect nature cannot be considered as environmental movement in this framework of Ehrman and Jamison. However, when we see environmental movement in this way, when we define environmental movements in this way, we find there are several problems. There are several problems of defining environmental movement in this social movement framework, where environmental movements are considered the activities which are outside the institutional process, which are outside the organizational process. So in this framework, movement ceases to exist or movement stop to exist once they enter into an institutional domain, in the sense that when environmental movement enters into an institutional domain, when the environmentalists become a part of the institutional domain, when they become a part of the decision making domain, they cease to be as movement participants. So this framework therefore may be useful to conceptualize early development of environmental movements, but cannot grapple its subsequent maturity and institutionalization. Because as we see in the current period, there are several activities, there are several environmental activities which takes place within the institutional domain, maybe within the domain of the state, within the domain of governance, within the domain of certain institutionalized politics. But if we follow Ehrman and Jamison's framework, we cannot consider this as environmental movements. So defined in this framework, many of the actions of professional organizations concerning environment do not qualify to be termed as environmental movement, because environmental movements are always anti-institutional, whereas in the contemporary times we see that there are many environmental activities which are institutionalized in nature. So therefore, contemporary environmental movements are not necessarily anti-institutional. Let's come to the second framework of understanding environmental movement from a social movement framework. Here I am referring to the Italian sociologist Mario Diani. Mario Diani considers that social movements need not be anti-institutional. So therefore, organized parties, or political parties can be a part of the movement. But Mario Diani insists on collective identity of the movement, in the sense that according to Diani, every movement produces a collective identity, a common identity, because it is this identity through which the movement's meanings are defined. So therefore, a movement produces certain identity and the movement's meaning is carried forward through this identity. But when we see environmental movements from this framework, does environmental movement provide, or does environmental movement produce a common identity? When we see the contemporary environmental movements, The participants are from such varied backgrounds, they are from such varied arena, they are from such diverse arena that sometimes it becomes difficult to establish or difficult to produce a common identity. So therefore, even though Mario Diani's framework of defining environmental movements through social movement framework includes institutionalized activities, organized activity, but Diani's insistence, Diani's emphasis on collective identity sometimes doesn't apply to contemporary environmental movements, because these environmental movements doesn't necessarily produce one collective identity, because the movement participants are from such varied backgrounds that they do not have many things in common. Like these contemporary environmental movements draw participants from upper class, from middle class, from lower class, from across class, from across ethnicity, from across gender. So therefore, the multiple nature, the multiple social background of environmental movement participants often results in, or often it doesn't result in creating a common identity. It is difficult to establish a common identity in contemporary environmental movement. So then how do we define environmental movements? When we see that social movement framework doesn't help us in defining environmental movements, how do we define, how do we conceptualize environmental movements? Perhaps it is better to understand environmental movements as they are. I quote again Manuel Cassel, who says that movement must be understood in their own terms. They are what they say they are. Their practice and their self-definition defines a movement. So therefore, following Manuel Cassel's definition, we may say that environmental movements are collective action around environmental alterations which describe a crisis in material, physical and symbolic basis of life. They may include public and political or organizational actions of resistance, as well as constructions concerning environmental change, degradation and destruction. So in that sense, what is essential about environmental movement, or what is essential about defining environmental movement, is a collective consciousness about nature. So therefore, issues like organization, issues like identity or issues like institution, they are not so much important in defining environmental movements. So let us take some of the definitions of environmental movement and see how can we conceptualize it. Environmental historian Ramchandra Guha defines environmental movement as an organized social activity continuously directed towards promoting sustainable use of natural resources, halting degradation of natural resources and bringing out environmental restoration. So in that sense, when we see environmental movement, when we conceptualize environmental movement, we realize that environmental movements are not necessarily protest. They are not necessarily protest against something. So therefore, protest becomes one component of environmental movement. Protest against environmental degradation, protest against degradation of nature constitutes one component of environmental movement. Environmental movement may also include activities for promoting environmental restoration. Environmental movement also may include promoting sustainable use of natural resources. So therefore, sustainable use of resources, sustainable or ideas about bringing out environmental restoration can also be included as environmental movement. So therefore, contrary to the conventional meaning that social movements are anti-institutional, social movements are protest against an institution, social movements are protest against the system, environmental movements sometimes can also be defined as constructive activities for restoration of nature. In that sense, activities for planting trees, or in that sense plantation drives or afforestation activities can also be considered as environmental movements, because environmental movements talk about not only protesting against degradation of nature, environmental movement also includes activities for environmental restoration. So therefore, activities for conservation of water, activities for creation of forests. So any kind of activities, a collective mobilization which includes activities for restoration of nature can also be included as environmental movement according to Ramchandra Guha's definition. Perhaps it becomes more clear when we see the definition of environmental movement by Christopher Roots, the British sociologist. Christopher Roots defines environmental movements as institutional and non-institutional networks. So therefore, what is important from Roots' definition of environmental movements are these movements, or the contemporary environmental movements, are essentially networks among people, networks among organizations, or networks among ideas and ideologies. And these networks can also be institutional, can also be organized, as well as non-institutional or non-organized. So these institutional networks consist of individuals and groups who have no organizational affiliation or organizational affiliation of varying degrees of formality, and even political parties, and which are engaged in collective action motivated by shared environmental concerns. But that the form and intensity of both action and concern may vary considerably from place to place and from time to time. So therefore, what is central in defining and conceptualizing environmental movement is the shared concern for nature. So therefore, there are certain things which define environmental movement, and the most important thing is the shared concern for nature. So environmental movement can be anti-systemic, it may not be anti-systemic. Environmental movement may be institutionalized, it may not be institutionalized. Environmental movements may be organized, may not be organized. What is important about environmental movement is shared concern for nature. So in that sense, environmental movements are not necessarily protest in the street against something. Environmental movement also includes constructive activities for restoration of nature. So let me summarize the first part of this lecture. In this part, we try to conceptualize environmental movement, and when we depend upon the social movement framework, we find certain uneasiness, certain problems in defining environmental movement, because social movement framework emphasize upon organization, social movement framework emphasize upon anti-institutionalism, and social movement framework emphasize upon common identity. So therefore, these three important characteristics of social movement, organization, anti-institutionalism or anti-systemic, and common identity, somehow becomes difficult to conceptualize environmental movements, because environmental movements can be organized, it may not be organized, and environmental movements are not necessarily anti-systemic, environmental movements are not necessarily anti-institutional, because right now when we see environmental movements, we realize that even environmentalists or environmental organizations, they also work along with the state, they work along with the government to design policies, to construct policies for environmental restoration. So in that sense, those activities which are carried forward along with the institution, along with the state, can also be considered as environmental movement. So environmental movements are not necessarily anti-institutional, environmental movements are not necessarily anti-systemic. They are also institutionalized activities which calls for an ethical attitude towards nature, which calls for activities for environmental restoration. So therefore, what is important to understand environmental movement is not its organization, is not whether it is anti-institutional or institutional. What is important to understand about environmental movement is the shared concern for nature. And secondly, environmental movement is a departure from industrialism, because it is almost commonly agreed that it is the industrialism or industrial way of life which has created certain levels of alteration of nature, and environmental movement tries to justify, environmental movement tries to undo these historical injustice with nature. So environmental movement tries to limit the negative impacts upon nature. In that sense, environmental movements are not anti-systemic, it is not against something. Sometimes environmental movements calls for a change in attitude towards the nature. Unlike other social movements where there is an adversary, unlike social movements where there is an enemy, there is an adversary against which the movement is fought. Environmental movements are not necessarily always against something. Environmental movements calls for therefore an ethical attitude towards nature. Environmental movement calls for an change in attitude towards the nature.